of increases in the amount of crime there. So to do tests like this, to assess like, well, what's the effect of like minority group composition, like here in the neighborhood or a sample of neighborhood? What are the effects of those types of categories on things like police force size, police use support, deadly force, whatever it may be? We have to account for increases in crime. We have to account for potential variation across context in the amount of crime that is. This is crucially important. This is crucially important to be able to do this. Otherwise, it could just be that crime is the spurious factor. It's tied to increases with alongside minority group composition and growth, and it's also the thing that leads to punishment, leads to arrest and use of force. We have to account for the amount of crime there is, and importantly, we do in the field. We do this. We have to do it. It's necessary. It's possible that this is what's going on. But the literature doesn't bear this out. We basically subject these mountains to really fancy statistical methods, which we can get into if you want to do. Sort of account, we do this in all theory testing, for example, but in this, for this perspective in particular, it's very important to be able to account the amount of employment. And when you do, you still see the effect of minority compensation growth on things like police behavior, police use of aggressive action. That's police behavior, generally. Sentencing, the story is really similar. The story is really similar. So in order to get a PhD, you have to write a dissertation. The dissertation is basically a book. And so I had to basically write a book. And so the topic of my dissertation was actually testing this theory using information on sentencing order. I had information basically on 1.2 million cases, felony cases that were exposed with Florida. I tested this theory in a variety of different ways. Anyway, so the literature on sentencing from our perspective shows a couple of interesting patterns, I think. The first is that in certain counties, particularly, what we're thinking about county is that county share judges problem. In counties with relatively large and or growing minority groups, Black and Hispanic population, all defendants in those counties are more likely, say, to get prison sentence. Now, again, we're not really accounting for the amount of crime there is, although we're doing that too. We're also accounting for things like case characteristics, offense type, criminal history. We're accounting for the things that sentencing guideline recommendations, all the things that are really directing judges and prosecutors sentencing decisions. We're accounting for those. You have to. It's important. It's not just like descriptive statistics and percentages. We're trying to model and predict. And what we're finding, what I found in research, is that in these areas, you can have a sort of general effect where if you are a defendant who's disposed and sentenced to one of these counties that experience large and or growing minority population, you're more likely to go to prison for longer. More likely to go to prison for longer. So in Florida, where the data comes from this page, there are certain counties in northern America, certain counties in the northern part of that are very like the Black population in those counties is very, very dominant, very, very. It's a definitely hard to be. So a lot of Black populations in those counties, especially like Gadsden County. Like, but the point is, like, if you're a white defendant being sentenced in one of these, like Gadsden County, which has a really large Black population, you as the white defendant are more likely to go to prison. Net of the characteristics of your own case, your own offense type, and criminal history, and all that. Why? So that is what's sometimes called use effect. What's sometimes called a use effect. Because it basically means that it's diffuse. It's diffuse across the population. Probability that you will encounter a type of coercive social control is diffuse, regardless of your own identity, your own groups to which you belong. You're more likely to experience this type of social control in these contexts, in these geographic areas that are characterized by large and or growing We see the same thing in the juvenile court also. It's not sentencing the juvenile court, it's like dispositions to things like secure confinement, that would be not prison. What you find is the exact same thing. You find that all adjudicated delinquents in areas that have large or growing minority populations are more likely to get secure confinement and parole. That's a diffuse effect. What we also find, beyond these sort of general diffuse effects, is we also find what are sometimes called targeted effects. Targeted effects. A targeted effect is when we're seeing an increase in disparity at the individual level in sentencing in particular. Although you can technically test this, so all of the right kinds of ways, all of the kinds of outcomes. But in sentencing, you look at the literature. So what we find oftentimes is that not only is it that all defendants in these areas that have large and/or growing minority populations, Black and Hispanic populations, are experiencing an increased likelihood of getting, say, prison and long that kind of thing. But what also happens is that there can be an increase in the difference in the probability of getting prison, jail, in these areas. And it increases the disparity between Black defendants and white, or between Hispanic defendants and white people. I've never mentioned this before, but why not? If you're curious, maybe you're not, but that's fine. The literature testing the effect of like Hispanic populations in places like Texas, being a Hispanic person is fundamentally different from being a Hispanic person in Pennsylvania or New York or Maryland or Minnesota, where there's a lot of sentencing in those areas. The fact that being a Hispanic person and likely to get prison is way bigger. Like the disparity between Hispanic and white is way bigger. And the effects of being in, say, a county that has a large growing Hispanic population, in a place like Pennsylvania or New York or Maryland or Minnesota, is sort of different than it is, and it's much bigger than it is typically in a place like Texas or in East or Western. So not necessarily what we would expect in Texas, but that's not what we're trying to basically in Pennsylvania. Hispanic ethnicity means something different than it does in Texas, right? Because of this like cultural visibility. So anyway, when you see an increase in disparity in this way, where you have courts in counties with relatively large growing minority populations, we're seeing is an increase in disparity. And this is sometimes called targeted. The threat effect does not affect all defendants equally, it affects minority defendants more. That's really sort of complex statistically. To be able to explain that, I mean, it has some terminology associated with it, but I do want to show you what this looks like. Again, does it work? Like, I press button, the info will light. So anyway, on the left here is a diffuse. Both of these come from papers that are online. But they were written by a white. So on the left here, we have an example of a diffuse effect. Now, this is maybe a little bit difficult for me. It's not a great graph. I did it. Okay. So to be clear, in Florida, it's like a non-custodial sanction, basically probation, jail and prison are like the three outcomes for felony events. You get one of those three things, typically, right? And it's complicated because states are complicated, but in Florida, that's basically get one of those groups. You get permanently, you get prison, you get juvenile, or you get to line versus Black criminals add up to a pairs because it's everybody. It's mutually exclusive and exhaustive. Everybody gets only one, and everybody gets one category. So what this means is that as percent line increases, the x-axis here, saying like triangle line increase. to up to like 50, yeah, 50%. It's an adjusted probability, accounting for things like events tied into the true. Whereas the probability of getting a non-custodial safety in a jail cell goes down as percent liability. What we have, that's a diffuse effect for everybody. Doesn't matter what the defendant looks like. In general, if your case is disclosed in accounting, the larger black population, net of the characteristics of your case, you're more likely to go. On the right here, I think this was a national study using data from a bunch of different states, if I'm not mistaken. And they made it look like Florida, but I could be wrong. And then on the right here, we have definitely a study that was also from Florida. And this graph is really confusing. Because now we have difference in odds and probability. And odds are really confusing, even for somebody like me who teaches statistics sometimes. So you have odds here, and odds ratio of one basically means equal probability of success versus failure. It's complicated. Anyway, where you have high black vote, you're basically seeing a difference in the odds, increased disparity between black and white defendants in the likelihood of going to prison. You need to label their axes. Create data visually. These people label your axes. Not great, but you can kind of see a general increase. I would have done it totally different, but it's the best graph I can find. What you can see is that where there is more black throat, so we're talking about a kind of dynamic, what's something called dynamic threat. When you see, when in those places where more threat is happening, the difference between black and white defendants, the likelihood of going to prison, probability, that's the problem, going to prison is increasing. Does all that kind of make sense? It's a little dark. It's a little blue. I mean, so we're not ending the course of this note, by the way. Talk about moral panics over here too. In terms of punitive sentiments, a similar kind of story emerges here as well. What we're interested not in at this point is not the actual application of things like police resources or police tactics or the decision making of criminal courts or juvenile courts for that matter. I said we're interested in the sentiments, punitive sentiments among members of the public, sort of like how we started the lecture. So what we find here is that minority group composition net of the homicide rate is associated with increases in support for the death penalty, especially on non-violent control. Perceptions of minority neighborhood seem to be important in terms of one's fear or perceived likelihood of victimization in one's neighborhood seems to be tied to if you perceive more minority living in your neighborhood. It's actually more important than the actual racial population of it. So the third point here is particularly interesting, I think. Contact. Interracial contact between people seems to make things worse rather than better. Interracial contact seems to make things worse rather than better. It increases the adoption of like anti-black stereotypes, anti-immigrant stereotypes. So it decreases. There's this theory that emerged in the 1950s. Take a psychology class related to this. Maybe you know it. It's called the contact hypothesis. And it expects the opposite. It expects that where there's going to be more intergroup contact, what you'll develop is like your mind will be open, those stereotypes that you develop, you reduce it, you sort of develop empathy, you develop like. There's a considerable amount of research that points to the opposite, sort of in line with this framework. They expect totally different things. This framework expects the opposite, which is where there's going to be more contact, there's going to be more perception of threat. And there's some research that points this out. It supports this idea that where there is more intergroup contact, they like assess people in neighborhoods and schools, and you see if they have more contact with members of, like, say, minority groups, and see if their attitudes change. And they do sometimes, and